Welcome today's speaker back to Notre Dame and back to conferences sponsored by the Center for Ethics and Culture. And it is, I think, testimony to the interest of his work that you all are willing to stay a bit longer in order to hear him. Not a single person left the room. So you can see how welcome you are. Today's speaker received his PhD from Harvard University, where he was a student of the great Carl Friedrich, mentor to so many in a great generation of American political theorists. His areas of specialization are the history of political theory, especially from the 13th through the 17th century, religion and politics, and Chilean politics. He's the editor and translator of a number of books, the author of 200 scholarly articles, and the author of 19 books, including Nicholas of Cusa and Medieval Political Thought, Natural Law in Political Thought, and, perhaps most relevant for today's session, Liberation Theology at the Crossroads, Democracy or Revolution. Paul Sigmund has been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, the Institute for Advanced Study, and he has received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities and from the Guggenheim Foundation. He has been interviewing liberation theologians and writing about liberation theology since 1986, and he'll speak to us today on Gustavo Gutierrez and liberation theology. Please welcome Paul Sigmund from Princeton University.
Thank you. I should simply beg your pardon as a Latin Americanist, because Latin Americanists are never on time. But actually, it was just being an absent-minded professor that I misread the time and thought I had till 1:45. I'm here because of someone who isn't here, and that's Gustavo Gutierrez. Gustavo Gutierrez is a professor, in case you didn't know, a professor of theology at Notre Dame. And as we originally worked this out, I was going to speak on Gustavo Gutierrez, and then he was going to reply. Now, when people ask me, where is Gustavo Gutierrez, I say, he's at Notre Dame when he's at Notre Dame. And as it happens, he is not at Notre Dame this weekend. So unfortunately, we don't have that privilege, so I'm going to have to sort of try to speak for him. And I don't think this is unfair in the sense that we've known each other for 15 years, and we're on a similar wavelength, although obviously I am somewhat more critical of his work than he is of himself, and I'll talk a little bit about the disagreement we have towards the end of the paper. But let me just start out by saying that this is a very important movement. The issue, I guess, that I'm going to deal with is whether it's very important historically or still today. It's a movement that started really 50 years ago in Brazil that didn't have the name, and it got a considerable impetus from the '68 meeting of the bishops, Latin American Bishops' Conference at Medellin, which published kind of revolutionary documents talking about capitalism as a system of the Latin American system as a system of institutionalized violence, and capitalism as structural sin. Gustavo Gutierrez was involved in writing some of those documents, actually, but it was a kind of circular process. He could then cite the bishop's approval of things that he'd written to defend his position, but he wasn't widely known internationally till 1970, when he published an article in the American Jesuit journal Theological Studies called Notes for a Theology of Liberation. And then a year later he finished the Spanish version of his book, A Theology of Liberation, and that was in ⁻73. That was translated into English and became a kind of worldwide bestseller, and he became a celebrity. He is sufficiently important, I'll give a plug here, to be included. I did an article and then 30 pages of selection from 50 books in an anthology that I recommend to all of you that will be coming out next year, called Law, Society, and Human Nature, Christian Perspective, something like that. And it's actually, Columbia University Press has now accepted it, and they're going to publish it in an interesting way. It's divided into Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox perspectives, and into analyses and texts. And there are going to be, I think, 2 volumes, bound volumes, one of analyses or articles on the subjects, and one of texts. And it involves usually no longer living theologians and Christian writers on law, society, and human nature. And they're actually, I think the only 2 living ones are John Paul II, may not be living for very much longer, and Gustavo Gutierrez. But I think what is of interest to this group will be that they're going to do paperback editions by religion, so that there will be a paperback, including both the articles and the texts, alternating articles and texts, for Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox. It was sent out, the articles were sent out for review, for evaluation, and I got a very favorable evaluation, except for one sentence that I wasn't too pleased with. It said Professor Sigmund's making a valiant effort to rescue liberation theology from oblivion. I don't think that's necessary, but that is what the article, to some degree, does. Because if you ask somebody these days, what is liberation theology? Young people never heard of it. People who are in their 30s or so will remember it as this strange Latin American product that was later picked up by feminists and anti-discrimination groups and advocates of ethnic rights, but originally was very much a Latin American set of ideas. And in the popular view, liberation theology is a combination of Christianity and Marxism. That's what you get when you ask somebody. Others will say, well, it's a Christian doctrine of revolution, and others will say, well, it's a peculiar product of the '60s that ended when the Cold War ended. Now, I think there are elements of truth in all 3 of those, but they're basically false. And what I'm going to argue, I'm going to look at specifically at the thinking of Gustavo Gutierrez. There are many other liberation theologians, most of them not very interesting, I must confess. The one other person who is interesting is, for a different reason, is Leonardo Boff, B-O-F-F, because he wrote some very interesting books. One on church charism and power, on the power structures in the church, and a number of other books, and got in a lot of trouble with the Vatican. And unlike Gustavo Gutierrez, who had some trouble, didn't extricate himself from it, and in fact enjoyed being a kind of co-celebre in Brazil, and refused to meet with me twice, because I was an American, so that tells you something about him too. And I guess one other little footnote on Leonardo Boff. In 1986, he came back from the Soviet Union, 1986, and said, this is the closest to the kingdom of God of any place on earth. But that's different. And each liberation theologian is different. But the one that has lasting value, and why he was included in this anthology, is Gustavo Gutierrez, who was the founder, who was the one who first gave this theological current its name. A Theology of Revolution was the title of his. A Theology of Liberation is the title he gave to it. Well, what made it so interesting, and what's distinctive about it? It was a kind of reaction against, what would I say, developmentalism, reformism, Christian democracy, the notion that the church can sponsor, or at least rather influence, political parties which will carry out a reformist mission, carry out the church's mission in a reformist fashion. And it emphasizes the revolutionary, especially the aspects that are critical of the power structure, especially the socioeconomic structure. So really the message is that, and it's a message that is supposed to be, I mean, they use the term rereading the Bible. Well, I must say, when I started reading it, I did reread the Bible, and suddenly I realized there's so much in there that's critical of the rich. and so much that is endorses the poor, that it is very hard to escape the conclusion that he came to, is that there is a very special part of the Christian message is a critique of wealth, and a concern for the poor. So this would be, so the liberation and the term liberation is taken from the Bible, from Isaiah 61. And I've come to liberate the oppressed, basically, and the free prisoners and so on. And then Luke 4, where Jesus you remember the time when Jesus is reading from in the synagogue in Nazareth, and he reads precisely Isaiah 61, talks about liberating the oppressed. Okay, so they're the kind of proof text. I guess also the Magnificat, he's put down the mighty from their seat and exalted the humble. And there are, well, he has a total at one in that first book of 300 biblical citations. But so there's a message there. Then there's a method. The method is one that is reducible possibly to the single word praxis. That is, and it's a word derived from Marx, who derived it from Hegel, that there is, you can learn from practice, and that abstract theories are not any good unless they're put into practice, and that you have to engage the virtues of engagement both as a kind of duty, but also more so as a kind of learning. So learning from the poor, and spending time with them, and identifying with their needs and their views and their worldview, and learning from that, from basically an application of the Bible to the problems of the poor. And this is what liberation theology study groups, including the Christian-based community, ecclesial-based communities that grew up in the 60s and 70s, would do. And then the third, and I think the one that got them into trouble, both got them into trouble and helped spread the appeal because of its radical message, was learning from the social sciences. Now, learning from the social sciences meant the social sciences of the day, and I taught in Latin America in the 60s. Today you go into a bookstore and all you see is Milton Friedman and free enterprise economics. But in those days, when you went into bookstores in Latin America, all you saw was Marxism. I'm not sure whether Castro was subsidizing or the Soviets through Castro. I don't know, but it was striking the difference today. So Marxism was seen as a way of understanding reality. And dependence theory invented by the last president of Brazil, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, in Chile at the time I was teaching there, which attributed the problems of Latin America to their dependence on the developed world. And sometimes people use the Spanish word dependencia theory, and as one of the great contributions. And there's a large literature now, pretty much stopped, occasional references, but so large literature, just to give you one example, because I teach Latin American politics, that at one point there was a text, English text written by Americans about Latin American politics, entirely written from the dependencia point of view. That was simply, they announced that at the beginning, and every chapter was why the problems with Latin America are caused by the dependence on the United States mainly. Okay, so this is a product of the 60s and 70s, but it links up, so a time of revolutionary ferment and of actual revolution, starting, of course, with the Cuban Revolution, but it's also a product of European thinking. Gustavo Gutierrez is a Peruvian of mestizo, part Indian origin, born in Lima in 1928, studied medicine and philosophy, and then joined the archdiocesan priesthood. And his talents were recognized, so they sent him to Louvain, where he got he wrote a master's thesis on Freud, and then theology at the Catholic University of Lyon, and he also studied in Rome, and was a chaplain to students after he returned to Peru at a time of radicalization of student movements in the middle to late 60s. And he lived in a poor section of Peru, and it was a time where Castro was actually supporting guerrilla movements in all over Latin America, including in Peru. I've interviewed some of the former members of those guerrilla movements. And the United States was trying to answer with the Alliance for Progress and support, for, among others, for Christian democratic parties as reformist and democratic parties as a response to the threat of the Cuban Revolution. It was also, I guess, the first kind of example of an alliance between Catholicism and guerrilla warfare, basically revolutionary movements, with Father Camilo Torres, who was a fellow student of Gutierrez at Louvain and a member of an elite Colombian family, and he became a chaplain. When he came back, organized a national reform movement, and when it didn't have any results, he joined the guerrilla movement and was killed in a skirmish with the Colombian military in '66. And this was a kind of dramatic demonstration of the link between the Catholic, what became later called the Catholic left, and this Marxist-influenced movements. And meanwhile, in the same decade, Pope Paul VI published Populorum Progressio, which attacked the international imperialism of money. Decried situations whose injustice cries to heaven, where whole populations, destitute of necessities, live in a state of dependence. In which recourse to violence as a means to right these wrongs is a grave temptation. Then he says, he criticized revolutionary action except in cases of manifest, long-standing tyranny which systematically violate human rights. But that reference to dependence was picked up from the Latin American literature, I assume. Gustavo Gutierrez attended the meetings of the Latin American bishops in '68 and had something to do with writing the document, he won't admit how much, a document on justice, which referred to conscientization, consciousness raising, which had been advocated by notably one Catholic writer in Brazil, Paulo Freire, again applying the Bible and religious insights to your experience and becoming aware of your being oppressed. So that again is incorporated in an official church document at this point. And the promotion of base communities again is endorsed. And the document on justice denounced the sinful situation in Latin America, in many Latin American countries, dependence on a central power around which they gravitate. It described the Latin American situation in many instances as one of institutionalized violence demanding profoundly renovating transformations. So this is, as I said, it gives a kind of official endorsement to a fairly radical approach to Latin America's problems. When he wrote Liberation Theology, he argued for a religiously based radicalism that offered an alternative to the reformism of Christian democratic and social democratic parties, as well as to the increasing number of military dictatorships in Latin America that had taken power in the name of rapid development and anti-communism. The alternative that he was advocating was not described in detail, but it clearly was linked verbally to the socialist tradition. How? One was that it denounced the present economic situation as a structure of sin. Another was to assert in his major book that the church must reject the dominant and economic system of dependent capitalism. So he quotes from the dependency theory, arguing Latin America is being kept poor and underdeveloped because of its dependence on and exploitation by developed countries. And he linked this to the class conflict. He specifically uses the term class struggle at this point. Dependence, he says, must be understood within the framework of the worldwide class struggle. There can be authentic development for Latin America only when there is liberation from the domination exercised by the great capitalist country, and especially the countries, and especially by the most powerful, the United States of America. To deny the class struggle is to put oneself on the side of the oppressors. To love all men does not mean preserving a fictitious harmony. Universal love is that which, in solidarity with the oppressed, seeks also to liberate the oppressors from their own power, from ambition, and their selfishness. Okay, so at the outset it has a Marxist-influenced flavor in terms of the terminology. There are differences, of course. The class struggle is between oppressors and oppressed, not between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And he never says, actually, that violence is the only solution, revolution is the only solution. But it is kind of reductionist to economic causations, and it does, in terms of as specific as the only, it doesn't get very much specific than to say socialism will essentially resolve the problems of the poor by eliminating the class struggle. So it uses it isn't straight Marxism, and most importantly, of course, it denies the atheism of Marx, explicitly denies the atheism of Marxism. So it differs in the kind of analysis of the economic forces. He's not talking the economic forces in terms of it's really the class struggle between oppressor and oppressed, but there is an economic solution, which is replacement of capitalism by socialism. What about the change from capitalist mode of production to the socialist mode involves moving to one oriented to a society in which man can live freely and humanly. He will have controlled nature, created the conditions for a socialized means of production, done away with private acquisition of excessive wealth, and established socialism. That's the beginning of this, and that's the one that people took notice when with that. And he specifically attacks Jacques Maritain and the Christian Democrats for reformism and developmentalism. He does not deny, however, the continuing effect of reality of sin. So while there's a kind of utopianism about this transformation that'll take place once you get rid of capitalism and replace it by socialism. But he talks about not only the liberation of oppressed peoples, but also as a freedom as a historical process leading to the creation of a new man and a qualitatively different society. But he also says you must work for liberation from sin, which is the ultimate root of all injustice and oppression. Marx never mentions sin. It says all three of them are interdependent. But socialism represents the most fruitful and far-reaching approach, although it can take different forms. So again, he's not endorsing Cuba, or in fact, he never did endorse Cuba. A lot of other left Catholics did. And he specifically mentions the indigenous socialism, sort of Indian socialism advocated by the Peruvian writer Jose Carlos Mariátegui. Okay, well, there's more on this. In the 70s, he's writing in these terms about overcoming the society divided by classes. And one of the things I found in my research is that he wrote specifically that line in 1973, but it wasn't translated into English until 1983, and then it was immediately attacked by Michael Novak in his book, his attack on liberation theology, Will It Liberate? And I remember reading the book and thinking, well, this isn't the Gustavo Gutierrez that I talked to a few minutes ago, and the reason was that it was I was talking to him, the Gustavo Gutierrez of the middle 80s. Novak was talking about the Gustavo Gutierrez of the 70s, and basically that's what I'm going to argue, that he moves away from the class struggle and the heavily Marxist approach. Although, as late as 1977, he's talking about the popular movement is also the locus of the encounter of the social sciences and Marxist analysis with theology. The project of crafting a new and different society includes the creation of new human persons who must be progressively liberated from whatever enslaves them. I don't want to overemphasize the Marxist element, because he does talk about the Bible and spiritual reflection, and even at the time he was writing these statements, he was also co-edited a book called The Mystical and Political Dimensions of the Christian Faith, with a deeply spiritual article that meditates on the Bible and human suffering, basically. He does this repeatedly, the whole question of how can a good God make people suffer the way they do, and then tries to deal with that kind of problem. He also never, as so many of the Christian left, Catholic left that I knew, didn't ever get sort of swept away in political movements. I saw that happen with Sandinistas that I knew in Nicaragua. That they were devout Catholics, liberationists, and couple of years later they were Marxists. The new religion had taken over. That never happened with Gutierrez. He always maintained a certain distance, and I guess the example that impressed me was when he was invited to speak at the Christians for Socialism meeting in 1973 in Chile, sponsored by and paid for the Allende government, a Marxist-influenced government. And he didn't attend that because he saw it as a political operation. And that final document of that meeting, the Christians for Socialism, did not have a single reference to the Bible, but it quoted Che Guevara and called for a strategic alliance between Marxists and Christians and a revolutionary praxis of the proletariat and takeover of power by exploited masses. So he knew what he was doing when he didn't go to that meeting. It was pretty clear where it was. But at this point in the mid-'70s, liberation theology had become a worldwide movement, and there are liberation theologians meetings in Europe and in the United States and in South Africa, and there are writers in the Philippines, in Asia, but through those meetings you began to get a criticism of the kind of obsession with economic oppression of the original version of liberation theology. And Gutierrez says, well, I did mention other kinds of oppression, even in the theology of liberation, but they didn't get much emphasis. Now, people were suddenly aware, I mean, they used sort of liberation theology terminology to deal with the oppression of blacks, of Indians, of women. And, of course, the oppression of women in Latin America is a major problem, continues to be. So at the various meetings at which he spoke and participated in Germany and in the United States and in Canada, this came out, and he began to incorporate that in his own thinking. And this was in the 70s was a time of military governments taking over most of Latin America. There's also, and it seemed, I mean, they just killed the liberationists. If you were a left Christian, you were disappeared, tortured, murdered, etc. in Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, lots of places, and they're still working that through. I was just down in Chile last week, and there are like 200 cases in the courts now involving this period of the 70s. So it seemed like, the possibility of a socialist transformation didn't seem to be very great at that point, when all of a sudden Central America, the Nicaraguan Revolution, wins in 1979, which involved an alliance of Marxists and Christians, including prominent members of the Jesuit order. There were also guerrilla movements in El Salvador and Guatemala, which had significant Catholic elements of support, and I won't go into the details of the history of Central America, but the whole movement gets a new lease on life when you have a place in which it does appear that the kinds of things that Gutierrez was talking about were going to happen, or were happening in the case of Nicaragua. At this point, the Vatican gets interested because they start getting worried. And the newly elected Pope flies, John Paul II, in 1979, flies to the meeting of the Latin American bishops in Puebla. And on the plane, he's interviewed by the New York Times, saying, what do you think about liberation theology? Because this became a major point of controversy, a major issue in the Puebla meeting in 1979. And his reply was, a theology of liberation, yes, but which one? So distinguishing between a genuine liberation based on the Bible and a false politicized liberation. And in his speech at Puebla, he denounced attempts to link Jesus to the class struggle and establish a parallel church of the poor, which the Nicaraguans were doing. But he also argued for a Christian conception of liberation, the need for a more just and equitable distribution of goods both nationally and internationally, and he criticized the ever-increasing wealth of the rich at the expense of the ever-increasing poverty of the poor. The final document of Puebla had something for everybody. It condemned the politicization of theology and the popular church, but endorsed Christian-based communities and committed the Latin American church to, and this is a quote that's then used a lot, the preferential option for the poor. And so then again, that becomes part of the kind of generally accepted, not a rhetoric, but beliefs of the Latin American Church. It's now been endorsed, and all the bishops know that sort of tagline. That is that you have a special responsibility of the poor. But then the Vatican moved in two more times. In 74 came the first instruction on certain aspects of liberation theology. This is Cardinal Ratzinger issuing for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, which talks about many varieties of liberation theology, but warning against those that borrow uncritically from Marxist ideology, and specifically criticizing the Marxist commitment to the class struggle, denial of human rights, and a partisan conception of the truth based on violence. The 74 document promised a 76 document, and this was more moderate and less confrontational. It committed the Universal Church to, they didn't say preferential option because that was too much sort of opposition, conflictive, but a love of preference for the poor, and again endorsed Christian-based community, provided they're in communion with the local and universal church. And it denounced those who propagate the myth of revolution based on a purely earthly plan of salvation, which can lead to a new form of slavery. A week after the second instruction was issued, the Pope sent a message to the Brazilian bishops, which then, but not now, had a much more sort of, quote, progressive orientation. And in that letter, he endorsed a correct and necessary theology of liberation, which is in full fidelity to church doctrine, attentive to the preferential but not excluding or exclusive love for the poor. Now, Gutierrez was under a certain amount of pressure at that point. He'd been denounced to the Vatican, and there was an investigation of his teaching, as there was above, and he wrote a response, which was later published in a later book, which cited the second instruction many times, and it said the second instruction's criticisms of modern individualism need to be deepened by drawing on the faith experience of the poor. And it still talked about the need for a radical change in the socioeconomic order, but he began to talk now about personal liberty, which he said was a necessary condition for authentic political liberation. And then later he talks about the requirement of human society as two requirements are justice and liberty. And talks about property, says there are many think, this is typical Gutierrez, many think, meaning he thinks, that a healthy balance between private ownership, social ownership, and state ownership would be a good way of meeting and promoting these two requirements. So he's moving away from the straight Marxist analysis. He condemns the terrorist violence of Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path, the guerrilla movement in Peru, and says it is necessary to defend democratic life, however imperfect and fragile. So a recognition that liberal democracy, bourgeois democracy, doesn't do everything, but it's better than the dictatorships, because it makes it possible under a democratic system to propose and defend alternative formulas for the construction of society. Then he talks about in another chapter of this book that included his response to the criticisms of the Vatican about theology and the social sciences, and specifically lists the differences between his view, the liberation view, and Marxism. And he defends that evidentia theory is different from Marxism and rejects the exclusivity and the atheism of Marxism, and argues against the direct derivation of specific party programs from theology. But it is really on the issue of the class struggle that the shift is most obvious, and that real shift takes place in 1988. There have been 12 printings of the 1973 edition by 1988, and so this was the 25th anniversary, and Orbis Press, which had published all his works, the Marinal publishing house, published a revised English translation of A Theology of Liberation. I don't know whether anybody else has done one. Well, I did. I went through it carefully and compared the two versions. Gutierrez wrote a new introduction, in which he emphasized the theological importance of the oppression of racial and cultural minorities and of women. Yet, despite his criticism of what he called a simplistic position, we were perhaps in danger of initially adopting in analyzing the situation of poverty. He continued to talk about structural causes, the economic and political relations of the wealthy and powerful nations to the poor and weaker nations, but there he could quote John Paul II. The new introduction also said the preferential option denies all exclusiveness, seeks rather to call attention to those of the first, although not the only ones, with whom we are in solidarity. Quotes from the letter to the Brazilian bishops, and then most significantly, a whole section that in the 1973 edition was called Christian Brotherhood and Class Struggle, is now called Faith and Social Conflict. So everywhere it says social class struggle becomes social conflict. Quotes John Paul, saying the Christian cannot remain neutral in face of poverty. But the Marxist footnotes, including a lengthy quote from Marx, are gone in the second edition, the revised edition, and replaced by a statement is added: the determinist approach based on economic factors is completely alien to the kind of social analysis that supplies the framework for liberation theology. And then a new footnote that says that quotes from his earlier statements to say the central issue is not the class struggle, but how to live faith, hope, and love in the face of conflicts analyzed by social sciences. Now he's writing. The whole Latin American left is changing on the abandoning Marxism mainly, basically, including some major parties like the socialists in Chile, who the president of Chile is a socialist. He's not a Marxist, but the socialists in those days had a significant. They were aligned with the communists and had a significant Marxist influence, but there was this kind of assertion of the recognition of the value of democracy, which I've already quoted, even whatever its its shortcomings, and then the Russians in Afghanistan. Meant that Russia was not a model, which it never really was for them. But even Castro's Cuba was beginning to run into trouble because of the diminution of Soviet aid. So one saw that something that had been a model for them to some degree, although replaced by Nicaragua later, it was kind of widely recognized that it was able to carry out these social reforms because of the infusion of Soviet military and economic aid. And the Sandinistas were, increasingly corrupt and had lost popular support, so that there is a kind of general rethinking, which culminates finally in the fall of socialism in the the wall comes down and so on, and then I guess the final nail in the coffin is Centesimus Annus. In 1991, the Pope publishes an encyclical on the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, the founding document of modern Catholic social thought. Commenting on the collapse of the Soviet Union, of the economic system it represented, the Pope asked whether this meant the capitalist system was the only alternative for the countries in the developing world. His reply recognized the fundamental and positive role of business, private property, and what he preferred to call the free economy, and that was taken up by the Wall Street Journal, Richard Newhouse, writing in the Wall Street Journal, and other observers in the West, to constitute a significant departure from the criticisms of capitalism in earlier papal writings. However, it's important to note that in the next sentence, he said the free enterprise system should be set within a, quote, juridical framework, which puts it at the service of ethical and religious values and of human freedom in its totality. Gutierrez commented on this encyclical, didn't refer to the endorsement of the market system, but did say talk about the next sentence, arguing that the Pope had recognized the necessary social dimension of freedom. And he also quoted with approval the Pope's reference in the same section to the danger of, quote, the spread of a radical capitalist ideology that refuses to even consider the realities of the marginalization and exploitation of the poor. Then Gutierrez went on to do another major historical project on Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican bishop who defended the rights of the Indians in the 16th century. In the 90s, his work got less attention, but he continued to write The bishops met again in Santo Domingo in 1992, and he commented on their final declaration, again picking up their criticisms of Latin American democracy as more formal than real, and their assertion that poverty and injustice were in themselves violations of basic human rights. He joined the bishop's criticism of neoliberalism, that is, the espousal of laissez-faire economics, as a cause of the increasing poverty of the masses in Latin American cities and of the crushing burden of debt owed by less developed countries. Then he delivered a paper in 1992, around the same year, in Lima, in which he sort of not retracts, but pretty much ends his dependence on dependency theory. He says dependency theory was an important tool of social analysis in the early years of theological reflection in Latin America, meaning the 60s, presumably. He admitted that he was now aware of its shortcoming, notably its overemphasis on the external causes of development. It's just those people out there are the ones responsible for external causes of underdevelopment. They're responsible for poverty, exploitation. He also concluded, however, that changing political international realities, notably globalization and transnational capitalism, had changed the way in which one should analyze the realities of socioeconomic life in Latin America. By the 1990s, Gutierrez was well known at American universities. He lectured regularly in summer programs at Boston College University, was a visiting professor at Brown and at Princeton Theological Seminary. He received honorary degrees from Harvard, Southern Methodist, Holy Cross, University of Toronto, and others. His writings were collected into an anthology. His spirituality was analyzed and compared to that of Simone Weil. And in the year 2000, after the appointment of a conservative archbishop to the Diocese of Lima, Opus Dei person, he joined the Dominican order to which Bishop Las Casas had belonged, and shortly thereafter became a professor of theology at Notre Dame. Okay, he changed his views. That is, the link to Marxism and dependency has been removed, but there are still a continuing concern about the nature of capitalist development, which has now become globalized, and that critique continues. But I guess the one question I sort of implied at the beginning was, why don't people pay more attention to him now? Why is he unknown on this campus? Why is my book on liberation theology, which went to press the day the Berlin Wall came down, the least selling of my 19 books? People aren't interested in reading about liberation theology. Well, I think part of it is that what excited people was the Marxism and the fear that Marxist takeovers in places like Central America or Chile. So in a way, it is a product of a particular set of times. But I would argue that it continues to have an influence in Latin America, at least, and I haven't looked at the rest of the world. I can cite a few examples. One would be the rebellion in Chiapas in 1994. The bishop there, Samuel Ruiz, was formally, endorsed repeatedly liberation theology and was supporting the Indians in their demands and in their struggle for their rights. For that, he was removed. But so there's a specific example. A second, less encouraging example would be Father Jean-Bertrand Aristide in Haiti, the present president of Haiti, who was clearly committed to liberation theology and wrote a little bit about it, not a very good book, but led the people, the poor of Haiti against the generals. And when he was overthrown, was then basically put back in power by Jimmy Carter and the American Navy in 1994. I've just been to Haiti, actually for the first time. I'm on the board of a wonderful charity run by a former chaplain at Princeton who raises his money entirely by going around to parishes every summer and has schools, has hospitals, has feeding programs, run by about 3 people, no overhead. So I was down there looking at it, and it's very depressing. because he's sort of like the others. I mean, he's got his thugs, just the way that the Duvaliers had the Tonton Macoutes. He's corrupt. His wife gets a cut from every. They privatized the telephone company by handing it over to his wife. His wife gets a cut from everything, every phone call. And since there are 1 million Haitians in this country, that's a lot of phone calls. And it's quite sad but it's the political culture, you just can say, and there's this fear of being overthrown, although I don't think that's a rational fear anymore. But at any rate, the hopes that we had, and I was certainly one. I was lecturing in Latin America when we reinstated Aristide, and I said I'm proud of America, and even though and it was done over the opposition of the Congress, over a lot of popular opposition. That was not an easy thing to do on the part of Bill Clinton. A more encouraging example would be Brazil, because in Brazil the liberation theologians. People influenced by liberation theology, especially, and the poor in base communities, became the base communities influenced by liberation theology became one of the main sources of leadership for the Labor Party, the PT, which became really the only really organized political party, really organized party in Brazil, and which took over one after another of the various cities. Didn't always stay in, but even major cities like São Paulo, about the third or fourth largest city in the world, were governed by people in some cases from very poor backgrounds, who had originally been conscientized, politicized by their contact with the thinking of liberation theology, and now they're in power. Basically, Lula. Now he does not come from a liberation theology background. He comes from a trade union background, but there are a lot of people around him in his entourage and in his party who were, in fact, and continue to be. And one specific example that I found very interesting the last time I was in Brazil was the landless movement. I mean, it looks like something out of the 60s. Sem Terra. The Sem Terra movement is a national movement. It still engages in land seizures. It has support from the church, even though the church, as I say, has become much more conservative. And you read the Brazilian newspapers, they'll talk about Sem Terra, and in fact, there's been a sort of problem in terms of when Lula came to power as to whether he was going to give all the land to the Sem Terra. Well, he knew he couldn't do that if he wanted to maintain maintain the economic system, which he does want to do. You can't redistribute what you haven't got, so there are some tension between the Sem Terra movement and Lula's government, but he has other priorities in terms of a poverty program, an education program, and so on. But I think this is an example of a continuing set of influences by this thinking. And finally, it's on the grassroots. I mean, you meet priests and nuns and young people and so on that still read or talk about liberation theology, who have these meetings, who talk about it, use the method, apply the Bible to their contemporary problems. So I guess I conclude saying that liberation theology no longer proposes socialism as the solution to poverty. Gutierrez's more recent writings are more explicitly spiritual, but they still criticize the injustices of the contemporary economic and political structures, particularly in their effects on the poor, and he still makes radical criticisms of the status quo and of national and international economic inequality. If, like most of those in the left, he does not have a fully developed alternative model of society, his teachings and writings continue to remind Christians that a central element of the message of the Bible is its criticism of the rich and its love for the poor. His books are still read and his teachings are heard, even if the political impact is indirect and long-term. He has not changed the world, but he has changed our way of thinking about the Christian message. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for some discussion, and if you want to sit, I'll move this thing so that you can see it.
Okay, good. You know, it's standing.
Yes, in the back.
Theology of Liberation, we understand, is it not true that that revised version has not been published in Spanish?
Good question. I don't know. That is that's a useful thing to know, which I should also include in the article. I have the version that's about to go to press. I have on my desk back at Princeton. So as far as you know, that the revised version did not come out in Spanish.
One of the criticisms that the Cardinal there in Lima had of him, that book had not been, the revision had not been made in Spanish. But I wondered if you had some knowledge.
I didn't know that, and it's a very useful thing to know. Thank you.
You don't have a covenant still an influence in Brazil, or
Well, he's dead now.
are you just
So, but he's remembered. The older people remember him. I met him first when I first went to Brazil in 1963. He's a wonderful, wonderful person. He wasn't formally part of the liberation movement, but he was certainly, encouraging this concern for the poor before Gutierrez starts writing. So
I didn't so losing and say something?
yeah, he's a remarkable person. Yeah, very warm, and you immediately respond to him.
Could you elaborate a little bit on Gutierrez's critique of Martin?
Of what?
Of Martin.
Okay, well, it isn't a systematic critique. It is basically sort of throwaway lines about we can't really achieve. Well, there is one basic critique. That is one basic critique which he says again and again, which is the distinction of planes. That is, he sees, Maritain distinguishing between the supernatural and natural, and seeing politics as distinct from religion. Theology deals with the supernatural, and politics deals with the natural, and they're mutually influenced, but they're separate. Now, he says, no, they're not separate. That Christians, Catholics have an obligation to apply the full understanding of their religion to their involvement in politics.
So you would basically reject Martin's integral humanism.
Yes. And that's explicit. Yeah. He mentions it specifically. Then there's a more general criticism of the Maritain influenced Christian democratic parties, that I think you can get something by simply by elections and by economic development, particularly because the economic development he sees as making the poor poorer rather than enabling you to resolve the problems of poverty. So there's a general criticism of that.
Thank you. Dr. Singh, I'm very, very grateful for your talk. I'm a seminarian from Costa Rica.
Oh.
Study for the Archdiocese of St. Paul. And in St. Paul, we have about 100, Minneapolis, we have about 150,000 Hispanics, from Argentinians to Mexicans, mostly Mexicans, with Latin Americans, even a couple of Costa Ricans, to my shame, and pride now. But I did want to ask, and I beg the audience's forgiveness, a bit more on the practical question rather than the theoretical. In your studies, particularly in the U.S., of all these immigrants that are coming in, and because a lot of them are coming in with these knowledge of and they have this sort of working idea of the CEBs or of the las comunidades eclesiales or the and they come in here and they work the system about jumping the border or getting your legal social security card and so on and so forth. I have hundreds of these in the parish, and when I come to them and they're looking for some sort of familiar church structure, what has been your feeling and your in your research about how the Hispanic stateside, they're going to say, we're coming with, I don't know if you would call them vestiges of liberation theology, and they're trying to mesh into the U.S. Parish. I think it's a mess, but even just some feedback on that to take back to the parish and the people would be, because it's incredible to just try to get them educated, much less catechized in some aspects while they're in this golden cage. They work, but they have no rights. Yeah. So, that they are. Do you have any reflections or any feedback with folks that you've been, or at least even with Gustavo, about?
Now, I wish he were here to comment on that, because I think he'd be more qualified to do it than I. Well, I guess one shouldn't exaggerate the presence of the base community structure in Latin America. It's there, but it tends to be sort of parish councils often now with that base community title. And in some ways, I've been struck when studying liberation theology. I also, I did a book, a collection on this, on religious freedom in Latin America, I've been struck by the rapid growth of evangelical Christianity in all over Latin America, especially Central America, Guatemala, especially, but Costa Rica too, and Chile, Brazil. And there, I think one of the reasons, there are many reasons, and when people ask me why have the evangelical Protestants, and they are called, all Protestants are called evangelicos in Spanish, why have the evangelical Protestants spread so much in Latin America? And I said, because they're evangelical. They go and knock on doors. Well, they knock on doors and say, come to our meeting. And they have a meeting in which people all help each other, get people jobs, keep the husband from running off with other women and getting drunk, and there's a kind of support group there, I think. And that's what the base communities were supposed to do. And that's what, that was a kind of insight that they had in the 60s, and that they still do to some degree. So you do find, you'll find immigrants that are evangelical Protestants, Pentecostals and so on. There's been some work done on that here in Notre Dame. So I guess the lesson would be we should have more base communities of people who do meet regularly to discuss the Bible, but also discuss their contemporary problems and how to deal with them. I've been looking just at Princeton had no Hispanics at all about 20 years ago, and now it has a very significant community. And the first ones that went after the Hispanics were the Protestant evangelicals. First ones, and they taught them English, and The second ones were Opus Dei. And Opus Dei set up, getting jobs and getting, and finally the local parish started a Spanish Mass on Sunday evenings. It has become one of the great sort of social events for all the Hispanics. I mean, there's a sort of continuing Latin fiesta at St. Paul's Church in Princeton from about 7 o'clock till about 9 every Sunday night. So that's one response. I mean, they see the church as the place where they can meet each other and where they can, and the church, and then the local parish did finally get involved in getting them jobs, in getting them health care and so on. So the parish structure can be one which does respond to these needs.
Yes.
Was there ever a significant appropriation of liberation theology by the church in North American inner cities?
Well, there were groups that talked about it, put it that way. There was a famous meeting in Detroit of liberation theologians from Latin America and from the United States. They tended mostly to be academics, but there were a couple of Protestant preachers and theologians who, and some inner city Catholic. I can't think right now of any. I mean, I didn't go down the list who was at that Detroit meeting of theologians, but there was a lot of talk at that particular meeting about its relevance to the American inner city.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, you mentioned briefly Paulo Freire's Conscientización. How deep, here we have like two profound movements of liberation theology and conscientization. How deep did those ties run between those, and how did those movements affect the dynamics?
Yeah, well, I guess my view of it, looking at it, kind of history of ideas and ideologies, which is one of my specialties, basically that it antedates liberation theology. That is, you have that movement, and I was and saw the Catholic left there, and the Freire movement was very widespread and widely known. But that was before anybody used the term theology of liberation. But when the theology of liberation, the liberation theologian movement began, they then incorporated that. So then you have the base communities, and then actually, instruction on how to conscientize, so that it's a pre-existing movement which then becomes part of the general movement, and a part that I think is very valuable. I mean, I think the theologians were wrong on Gutierrez was wrong on capitalism as the cause of poverty and socialism the cure, but I think he was right on the need to listen to the poor, and for the poor to be able to help themselves, and for the priority of concern for the poor for Christians.
Paul, if you're agreeable, can we go?
Sure. Oh, sure. I should have came in late. Yeah,
I'll shut the door.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
Not to disturb people out there.
Can you give us a sense of the extent of the influence of Opus Dei in Central and South?
Enormous. It is, the next president of Chile will be, elected by a large majority, will be a very active and public member of Opus Dei, the present mayor of Santiago, Joaquin Levin. Just to give the example, the Chilean example, which I know best, because I read a lot about Chile. There's actually a book now, which I just saw, I was just in Chile last weekend, and there's a book called The Empire of Opus Dei in Chile, 700 pages, and describes the whole development. And Chile, of course, when people think of Chile as a place where you had a Marxist government and left-wing place, but, there's a basic conservatism, particularly in the upper classes. But it happened much earlier in places like Guatemala, in Mexico, they're significant. The development, I think, is particularly strong. They're doing what the Jesuits used to do, which is get very good secondary and university level schools and recruit people that way. And there was this movement, which I traced in my book, actually, Liberation Theology, where the Jesuits moved left, and so the upper classes looked for something else, and there's Opus Dei, ready and willing and with the money, and enormously well organized, and very dedicated. I mean, I've just been looking at, actually, Father Scully here and I are going to talk about this together in a little while, because he's going down to Chile to do a project on this. What has now become the largest party in Chile, the largest party used to be the Christian Democrats until the last election. The largest party now is the Opus Dei party. And how do they do it? Well, basically, small group of dedicated, wealthy, well-educated, technically educated economists, bankers, and so on. People who are have a vision of how the society should be, who know each other and work together, who then develop roots out in the shanty towns and have for a long time, even under the dictatorship. And they were aided in doing that by the dictatorship, because the dictatorship named the mayors. They weren't elected, and the mayors that they named often were the Opus Dei people. Similar things. I mean, Opus Dei cardinal in Lima, Opus Dei bishops in Salvador. I mean, you can go all over the continent, and they're less conspiratorial, I'd say, now than they were, in the sense that it's pretty much open, what they're doing. And I used to interview people say, "Are you a member of Opus Dei?" and they would sort of dodge the question. That isn't true anymore.
Is there concentration mostly for the upper class?
Well, no, this combination I mentioned, that is, you have, and people before they become powerful, I remember people telling me that the Opus Dei is out in all these shanty towns around Santiago, working with them, and essentially establishing a kind of political structure as well as programs of education and so on.
Is it spiritual? You don't use that word.
Well, I would use that word. I mean, I think it is. I mean, it's spiritual and political. I mean, I think they're motivated by religious incentives and religious concerns and dedication, but it has it's linked to a rather conservative political and economic, more economic than political.
There isn't a sense of separation of claims as there in my time, central unionism, that both political and the religious are pretty much...
No, in fact, I mean, the reverse. I mean, I was struck at the last election when the Opus Dei guy almost won. He was 1.5 points behind the socialist. And right after, he went to the shrine of Our Lady of something or other out somewhere on television. I mean, it was sort of thanking Our Lady for her gift of the success of the polls and so on. So no, there isn't a distinction of claims. And of course there are questions about what does that mean in terms of imposition of Catholic norms. Well, there are issues. I mean, any of you have been reading the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal will have seen this article on the divorce law in Chile, and they're very much opposed to any kind of divorce. It's the only country besides Malta which does not allow any kind of divorce, although they're extremely loose about annulments. If you just buy it, you could buy an annulment. So there'll be interesting issues if they do come to power, but it is it is important and growing, I'd say, all over Latin America.
Okay, I know there are a lot of people who want to get in. What would you think about just inviting the couple of people whose hands are up to give you their questions?
Yeah, okay, all together. Okay, let's do that. Let's do that, yeah. Good idea.
Yeah. So I'll just go around and allow everybody to ask a question, and Paul will answer them.
This is just a
small one. Did I understand that right? When you talked about conscientization,
Yeah.
that was the same as politicization. So that was not raising the consciences of the rich people that they should give something to the poor, but raising the poor people, what kind of conscience, so that, I mean, what's the notion of conscience?
Did Gutierrez ever directly respond to any other criticism by the thinkers in the Catholic?
He said he was preparing something. I don't think he ever did. He and I discussed this at one point about, an answer to my critics. But no, he did not.
And
Sorry.
one more. Yes.
I've heard that Gutierrez's liberation theology was influenced a lot by at least certain elements of Karl Rahner's theology. I was wondering if you could just comment on that. Is that true? And which elements?
I have not examined that question. I mean, but the opponents say, this is nothing but warmed over European thought. And I would disagree. I mean, I think this is a authentically Latin American. I mean, so he uses some European terms, but it's an authentically Latin American project. On the conscientization, this is a general problem that liberation theology has had from the beginning. Do you favor the poor and only deal with the poor? What about the rich and changing their views? But the people who are supposed to be conscientized are the poor, yeah, and the poor being workers, but also peasants, rural poor as well.
I think I see the spirit moving over the
Okay.
Again, it seems to be said. If others would like to talk at all, feel free to